I was in a ride share yesterday, stuck in the usual gridlock. And the driver, he was this calm, middle-aged guy, had the radio on, not music, but one of those high-octane political talk shows.
Oh, I know the kind.
Exactly. The host was just breathless, railing against the enemies inside the new administration, painting this picture of a country under siege. But what really fascinated me wasn't the host's volume, it was the driver's reaction. He wasn't angry, he was soothed.
Soothed. That's interesting.
Yeah. Every time the host delivered some really sharp insult or a totally one-sided claim, the driver would just nod, tap the steering wheel, and mutter, "Exactly." To him, this wasn't commentary. It was, validation. He turned to me at a red light and said, "Finally, someone is just telling it like it is without all the filter."
He felt like he was getting the real story.
He truly believed he was hearing the raw, unvarnished truth. But here's the twist, and I'm sure he didn't realize this. 40 years ago, that radio program would have been, for all intents and purposes, illegal.
Completely illegal.
If we were sitting in that same car in, say, 1980, the station manager broadcasting that show would have been sweating bullets, terrified the FCC was about to revoke their license. They would have been legally required to drag someone into that studio to argue the exact opposite point of view.
Right.
The driver's unfiltered truth is actually a pretty new product, and it was created not by some change in reality, but by the deletion of a single regulatory paragraph back in 1987. It feels like we're all navigating a world where the map has been deliberately cut in half, and most people don't even know the other side of the territory exists anymore.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive into that missing paragraph, the Fairness Doctrine. It's this one regulation whose demise just fundamentally reshaped the American information ecosystem and led us, I think, directly to the partisan media world we're all living in today. Our goal here is to give you a shortcut to understanding how we arrived here and why the government is now trying to use these old regulatory tools on this radically new digital landscape.
What's so fascinating about this, I think, is that this massive political and cultural shift wasn't really driven by ideology at first. It was built on a foundational constitutional argument, this one idea of scarcity. For decades, the law treated media as a two-tiered system.
Right.
And we really need to understand how that legal distinction was created, why it collapsed in the 1980s, and how our major institutions are now scrambling to adapt to this digital reality where information is abundant, but shared consensus is incredibly scarce.
So our mission today is to trace that history, explore the fallout, everything from deep national polarization to the executive branch's aggressive new use of regulatory power, and then look at the really difficult choices that democracy is facing in this new age of information abundance.
And to really grasp the power and the eventual failure of the Fairness Doctrine, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the birth of broadcast media regulation. It was born out of pure technological necessity and chaos, not some high-minded desire for civic instruction.
That chaos is such a crucial starting point. I remember reading about the early days of radio, in the 1910s and 20s. It was a complete free-for-all. Everyone was broadcasting whenever they wanted, just stepping all over each other's signals.
Exactly. I mean, imagine a bustling marketplace where everyone is shouting on the same tiny corner. In the early 1900s, this was a literal physical problem. Mm-hmm. And the problem became deadly serious in 1912 with the Titanic disaster.
Right.
Distress calls were going out from the sinking ship, but amateur radio operators all along the East Coast were just flooding the airwaves with chatter, with rumors, creating massive interference. And on top of that, the military demanded priority access to clear airwaves for national security.
So you have this inability to clearly communicate during a national tragedy, combined with military urgency and then the sheer physical limit, just too many people wanting to use too few frequencies. It basically forced the government to step in.
It did. And that intervention led to the Radio Act of 1927 and later the Really Comprehensive Communications Act of 1934, which is what created the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. The government had to manage this public resource. It decided that since not everyone could broadcast, they had to license specific users.
And the centerpiece of those acts, really the foundation for all the regulation that came after, was the standard for issuing that broadcast license. Public interest, convenience, or necessity.
It's a purposefully broad, almost moralistic mandate, but it gave the FCC the sweeping authority it needed. The government's whole premise was that they needed to pick who got to broadcast because the airwaves, the electromagnetic spectrum, they were considered a public resource belonging to all citizens. And this general mandate, It evolved, and by 1949, it was formalized into the Fairness Doctrine.
Okay, so what were the specific, concrete duties the Fairness Doctrine put on broadcasters? You mentioned there were two, and they were seen as essential for keeping that license.
They were the sine qua non, the indispensable requirements. The doctrine defined two very specific duties. First, you had an affirmative duty to cover controversial issues of public importance.
So you couldn't just play it safe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Broadcasters couldn't just stick to benign programming. They had an obligation to engage in the public conversation. And second, there was the duty of presenting contrasting viewpoints. When you covered those controversial issues, you had to ensure a reasonable opportunity for the presentation of opposing sides. You couldn't just ignore dissent or other perspectives.
So if a station in Omaha did a hard-hitting editorial about, say, a proposed local tax hike, they couldn't just end the segment there. They had to go find a taxpayer advocate or a politician who was against the tax to give them a reasonably equivalent platform. That's the practical application exactly. They had to achieve some level of balance, and that was judged across their overall programming, not necessarily in every single segment. And the entire edifice of this regulation, the government telling speech providers what content to carry, it all rested on one single, powerful legal justification: the scarcity doctrine.
The idea that the electromagnetic spectrum was a fixed natural limitation, and therefore it belonged to the public, which justifies government oversight. And the Supreme Court, they put their final, undeniable seal of approval on this in 1969 with the Red Lion broadcasting case.
Red Lion is the constitutional high-water mark for broadcast regulation. And the context is fascinating. It all stemmed from a journalist, a guy named Fred Cook, who was personally attacked on air by a radio host during a Christian Crusade program in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Cook demanded airtime to respond, and the station refused. The case went all the way up, and the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the Fairness Doctrine.
And the language that Justice White used in that decision is, well, it's legendary for how it focuses on the public over the provider. It is. White famously wrote, "It is the right of the viewers and listeners, not the right of the broadcasters, which is paramount." This is a profound reversal of typical First Amendment protections.
It totally is.
It meant the public's right to be comprehensively informed, to hear diverse viewpoints, that trumped the broadcaster's claimed First Amendment right to have absolute editorial control over their own airwaves. It was a massive victory for government oversight in the name of a mandatory civic duty.
That ruling, though, it immediately set up a constitutional double standard for media that becomes just startling when you contrast Red Lion with a case that came just a few years later, Miami Herald publishing Co. v. Tornillo in 1974.
The Tornillo case is the perfect legal counterpoint. The situation was functionally pretty similar. Florida had passed a law requiring any newspaper that criticized a political candidate to give that candidate a free right of reply in its pages.
So basically a fairness doctrine for print media.
Exactly. But the Supreme Court struck down the Florida law, also unanimously, ruling it violated the newspaper's editorial autonomy.
So why the different response? Why was forcing a broadcast station to air opposing views constitutional, but forcing a newspaper to print them was a First Amendment violation?
The answer lies entirely in the scarcity doctrine. The court ruled that forcing the newspaper to print the reply was a violation of the paper's First Amendment rights because it amounted to compelled speech. They stressed that the scarcity argument just didn't apply to newspapers.
Okay.
Even though starting a major metropolitan newspaper was incredibly expensive, that's an economic barrier, the court emphasized that the physical limitation of the electromagnetic spectrum was absent. Anyone with enough capital could, in theory, start a new newspaper. You couldn't just conjure up a new frequency out of thin air.
So the government's power rested entirely on the technical reality of the airwaves, that fixed physical limitation. This created a constitutional two-tier system that lasted for decades. Print media had nearly absolute First Amendment protection, freedom from content obligations, while broadcast media operated under a government-mandated civic duty tied directly to managing a scarce public resource.
That is the essential takeaway. For 40 years, the level of constitutional protection your speech received depended almost entirely on the delivery method. Was it ink on paper? You had absolute freedom. Was it a radio wave? You had a civic obligation. And that distinction, it was about to become technologically obsolete.
And that two-tiered system, the one built on this fragile pillar of scarcity, It just started to crumble in the 1980s. The great inflection point was 1987, when the FCC formally repealed the Fairness Doctrine.
And this wasn't an accident. This was a very targeted move during the Reagan administration, led by the FCC chairman at the time, Mark S. Fowler. Fowler was known for his view that television was just a toaster with pictures.
Right, meaning it was a consumer product, not some kind of public trust.
Exactly. His goal was deregulation across the board.
So what were the FCC's official justifications for abandoning the doctrine? I mean, it had been upheld by the Supreme Court just 2 decades earlier.
They leveraged 2 powerful arguments against it. First, they argued that the scarcity argument was obsolete. They contended that the explosion of cable television, satellite communication, and just the sheer proliferation of new outlets meant the original physical limits of the spectrum no longer justified such intrusive government content regulation.
Their argument was, if there are hundreds of channels, market competition, not government mandates, will ensure diverse viewpoints are heard.
That was the idea. And the second argument was more of a practical criticism, the so-called chilling effect. This suggests the doctrine was actively undermining the very thing it was designed to achieve.
How so?
Well, the FCC argued that the requirement to present contrasting viewpoints was just so burdensome, it required extensive record keeping, constantly defending against administrative complaints, having to seek out potentially hostile guests, that many broadcasters just decided to avoid controversial local topics altogether.
So why risk a license renewal fight over a tough documentary about local corruption when you could just run another sitcom?
Precisely. The fear of having to provide free airtime or defend against an SEC complaint caused a chilling effect, and that led to a demonstrable reduction in coverage of vital public issues. And that sounds incredibly convincing to a regulator who's trying to maximize speech, even if it leaves the door wide open for partisan content.
It was convincing, and it fueled the political momentum. The repeal wasn't quiet, though. I remember Congress tried to fight back. They recognized the cultural importance of the doctrine.
They did. They passed the Fairness and Broadcasting Act of 1987, trying to codify the doctrine into law to bypass the FCC.
And it passed both the House and the Senate.
Yes, but President Reagan vetoed it. He argued explicitly that it was a violation of free speech and constituted government meddling in journalistic decisions. Congress failed to override that veto, and the doctrine was formally dead. It was just deleted from the regulatory map.
And the immediate socio-political ramifications were seismic. I mean, this repeal is widely considered the single most important catalyst for the fragmentation of the American information ecosystem.
It removed the threat of sanctions. If a broadcaster decided to cater exclusively to one ideological niche, that provided the commercial green light for a whole new era of highly partisan media. You could now monetize outrage and identity politics without any regulatory counterbalance.
And you see the direct result in the rise of conservative talk radio. Figures like Rush Limbaugh became these national phenomena because stations could now focus solely on one strong, provocative viewpoint without the regulatory hassle of presenting counterarguments. This blueprint was later perfected by cable news.
And this shift just fundamentally altered the national conversation. It led to the fragmentation of our shared reality. You can see the human cost of this polarization so clearly in that anecdote about Sarah and her father, Frank, in Ohio.
Right. The story of Sarah driving home and realizing that she and her father, Frank, they just don't have a shared language anymore to talk about current events. She remembered watching the news with him in the 70s. They started from the same set of facts, even if they disagreed on how to interpret them.
But post-1987, Frank's media diet changed completely. He is now perpetually funneled into this hyper-partisan conservative radio and television silo. So when Sarah tries to bring up a fact she read in a centrist paper or saw on a traditional network, Frank doesn't just disagree with her. He genuinely believes she's either lying or misinformed because his sources, which are now his only sources, never even acknowledged that piece of information existed. The consequence is that the basic foundation of truth has splintered. The loss of that shared public square that was mandated by the Fairness Doctrine meant people were no longer required to hear opinions outside their comfort zone or even acknowledge facts that didn't support their pre-existing beliefs. That gap becomes generational, a profound loss of civic connection.
That is the core social ramification. You have the removal of the regulatory defense for balance, coupled with technological change, and that just fueled the system of filter bubbles and echo chambers we all inhabit now. It made political polarization structurally inevitable, not just coincidental.
And speaking of technology, while the FCC used the rise of new media as its justification in '87, the ongoing acceleration of technological change, cable, satellite, the internet, only further proved that the original scarcity theory was flawed. It just accelerated the judicial shift away from the doctrine for good.
Oh, absolutely. The Supreme Court began dismantling the scarcity argument for new media platforms almost immediately. In Turner Broadcasting System, Inc. v. FCC in 1994, the court was already drawing a line between the new media and the old.
They explicitly distinguished cable television from broadcast, right, ruling that cable did not suffer from the inherent limitations of the electromagnetic spectrum. Cable could theoretically carry hundreds of channels, unlike the limited broadcast band.
And by 1997, when the court reviewed the Internet in Reno v. ACLU, the scarcity argument was functionally obsolete for digital platforms. That ruling deemed the Internet an unlimited, low-cost capacity for communication of all kinds.
The court's logic was that the internet could transform any speaker into a town crier and any user into a pamphleteer. So therefore, the relaxed First Amendment scrutiny that was previously applied to broadcast media, it was just unnecessary. The digital world was constitutionally protected, like print, free from any government-mandated civic duties.
And this collision of deregulation and hyperabundance brings us to the present crisis. We need to step back and look at the sheer scale of this change, maybe through the lens of history, specifically Martin Gurry's thesis about communication waves.
Right. Gurry argues that the internet and social media represent the fifth wave of communication, an expansion that is, truly cataclysmic. When you look at the raw data, the growth is just mind-bending.
The information surge is unprecedented. Gurry calculated that the amount of information produced globally in 2001 alone was double the amount produced by the entire human race from the invention of writing until that point.
Oh.
And then the amount produced in 2002 doubled 2001. We are living in an exponential explosion of information.
And the result of this tsunami. According to Gurry, it overwhelmed traditional sources of information, leading directly to a systemic collapse of trust in government and media institutions, because they simply lost their monopoly over information and narrative control.
The traditional gatekeepers, the editors, the networks, the politicians, they lost their power to decide what passed for truth. The public gained immense power overnight. But Gurry highlights this paradox. The public is empowered to challenge and criticize elites. He calls it the revolt of the public. But they are fundamentally in repudiation mode.
Meaning they're masters at tearing systems down, like the leaderless movements of the Arab Spring, but they lack the cohesive structure or shared vision to construct viable alternatives. So it leads to political standoff, fragmentation, and global dysfunction.
And this is why viewing it as a recurrent pattern can help mitigate some of the panic. Communication revolutions always bring an initial, painful crisis of authority. We've been here before.
The prime example is the printing press in the 15th century. It struck society like a bolt of lightning, decentralizing gatekeeping overnight and radically lowering the cost of sharing ideas.
Before Gutenberg, censorship was relatively easy because printing was expensive and centralized. But once printing became cheap, information and misinformation just flooded the market. Truth itself splintered. You could print scientific discoveries, political manifestos, or detailed instructions for magic spells and conspiracy theories. The old authorities, like the Catholic Church, they just couldn't cope.
And that technological disruption directly fueled the Protestant Reformation. Luther's 95 Theses, which was essentially a detailed critique of church doctrine, spread across Germany in weeks. It turned a contained theological dispute into a continent-wide religious schism and decades of war. The printing press led to informational chaos before society found a way to manage it.
Exactly. And it wasn't until the rise of new institutions, the sovereign nation-state, professionalized publishing, and eventual secular governance, that society adapted to a pluralistic, information-rich environment. And that adaptation took over a century of intense conflict.
The next major wave was the mass media era of the 20th century radio and television. These technologies enabled mass persuasion on an entirely new scale. You think of FDR's fireside chats or, tragically, Nazi propaganda.
These media created a very centralized I talk, you listen model, which initially fostered high public trust. But that trust could be easily exploited, which led to incidents like the 1938 War of the Worlds radio panic, where millions of people genuinely believed Martians had invaded.
And then television later brought institutional failures directly into people's homes. The Vietnam War being called the Living Room War, the Watergate hearings, all of which accelerated a collapse of trust in the government from the late 1960s onward.
But importantly, this mass media era found a temporary equilibrium. It was tamed by codified norms like professional journalism, editorial standards, and crucially, regulations like the Fairness Doctrine, which ensured that even a limited number of broadcasters upheld a standard of balance. This gave elites a temporary semi-monopoly over information, which helped maintain a shared national narrative until the digital age shattered it for good.
Which brings us back to the stark reality of the digital double standard. I mean, we need to look at the irony experienced by someone like Elias, the retired AM radio engineer outside of Pittsburgh.
Elias spent 50 years of his life inside a broadcast booth, governed by the scarcity doctrine. He was an engineer, but compliance was his co-pilot. If his station aired a controversial editorial about, say, environmental regulations affecting local industry, you had to find a dissenting voice, a spokesperson for the environmental group or a rival business, to put on air to satisfy the FCC. It was a mandatory civic duty, the cost of his license.
But now he's retired, he's scrolling through his tablet, and he's watching some popular streamer, a digital news influencer, broadcasting wild, unchecked conspiracy theories about the new administration using the infinite resource of the internet.
And that influencer faces zero obligation to be fair or balanced. They operate with absolute First Amendment freedom, the kind of freedom that was previously reserved only for print media. Elias is forced to confront the profound obsolescence of his entire professional ethics framework.
His old, heavily regulated radio station, still bound by rules based on 1920s technology, is now an informational relic. And it's been eclipsed by a digital ecosystem that has no civic mandate whatsoever.
It powerfully illustrates the shift in the nature of scarcity. The scarcity today isn't in airwaves or digital space. The true scarcity is human attention, and that compounds the problem because platforms are now actively engineering algorithms to capture that scarce attention, often by prioritizing conflict and polarization.
That scarcity of attention is where the real regulatory dilemma lies today. We've moved from regulating a physically scarce public resource, the airwaves, to questioning how to regulate an abundant digital resource, our feeds, where the impact is what's scarce, our attention.
Which leads us to the algorithmic dilemma that the platforms are facing. Let's look at that story of Marcus, the high-level algorithm engineer in Silicon Valley. He's under intense pressure from regulators and civil society groups to implement a balance patch, which is basically an algorithmic fairness doctrine, to inject opposing viewpoints into users' feeds to combat the documented rise in polarization.
So he's trying to do the right thing, in theory?
He is. He's running A/B tests to see what happens when the machine is forced to show users content they didn't explicitly seek out, say, showing a hard-left user a reasonable argument from the center-right, and vice versa. But what happens is his engagement metrics, the lifeblood of the platform, they just plummet. User retention drops off a cliff.
Why? Because the machine prefers conflict.
The data confirms that people hate having their filter bubble popped. The algorithm is commercially incentivized to promote rage-inducing, polarizing content, because that's the content that drives clicks, shares, and watch time. Conflict is more profitable than consensus.
And this just confirms the fundamental difficulty of applying these old public interest standards to new, attention-driven technology. The platform's commercial incentive is division, not unity. The old regulatory model was based on controlling the supply of scarce real estate. The new model requires controlling behavior within an infinite space, and that raises massive First Amendment concerns.
But while the digital debate rages, traditional broadcast media is still grappling with its lingering public interest mandate, especially when it comes to key civic duties like political debates.
The presidential debates have historically been seen as the single unifying content market, a moment of shared national attention. But in the year 2000, we saw two major networks, NBC and FOX, just refuse to air the first of the scheduled general election presidential debates.
Right. NBC cited a Major League Baseball conflict. FOX chose to air an action-adventure premiere instead.
That defection raised the core legal question. Post-Fairness Doctrine repeal, did the FCC still have the residual authority to compel coverage of major civic events if a major broadcaster decided to prioritize profit over public interest?
And this is where legal scholars suggested moving beyond the physical scarcity doctrine of the 1930s and adopting a hypothetical market power analysis as a regulatory test. The argument is, if the government can't regulate based on physical scarcity anymore, maybe it can regulate based on economic or market scarcity.
So like an economic antitrust approach applied to the First Amendment, how would that work in practice? What are the steps?
You apply standard antitrust economics.
Yeah.
So first, you define the geographic market for a presidential debate. That's national. Second, you define the product market. And this is critical. You have to define live debate content as its own distinct product market, separate from interchangeable content like candidate rallies or websites. A live, simultaneous debate has unique value.
Okay, and the third step is to quantify the market power. So the question becomes, where does the majority of consumption happen? If the majority of viewers are relying on the traditionally scarce medium, broadcast TV, then maybe regulation is justified.
Let's apply that to the 2000 debate defection. The total viewership for that first debate was about 46.6 million households. Even with the rise of cable, broadcast TV still carried approximately 35 million of those households.
So that means broadcast TV, the regulated scarce medium, still carried over 75% of the debate audience.
Correct. And that high market share strongly suggests market power. Under a market-based approach, this would justify applying the relaxed red line scrutiny at that time. The majority of viewers were still reliant on the traditionally scarce medium, giving the FCC a constitutional hook.
So federal oversight or pressure to carry the debate would have been constitutionally appropriate in 2000 because of broadcast TV's dominance over that specific content market. But the goal of this entire complex test is actually to incentivize the opposite outcome, right?
Precisely. The core incentive is that maximum First Amendment protection would be granted to content that is widely distributed through multiple media outlets. If the debate audience was fragmented, say 50% watching online, 25% on cable, and 25% on broadcast, then broadcast TV would lose its market power for that content, and the old regulatory authority would dissolve. It would force regulators to acknowledge the reality of new, abundant platforms. The purpose is to speed the convergence to abundant technologies, moving regulatory power away from content and toward infrastructure.
But as this media landscape fragments and the legal boundaries get blurrier, we're now seeing this unprecedented attempt to reassert control from the executive branch. And this isn't about reintroducing the Fairness Doctrine. It's about weaponizing the remaining regulatory levers against perceived enemies.
The groundwork for this was laid in the first administration, with a foundation of really aggressive rhetoric, the systematic delegitimization of the independent press as fake news and the enemy of the American people.
And that rhetoric isn't just noise, is it? It systematically erodes the trust that media institutions need to operate. We also saw direct access battles revoking credentials for reporters like Jim Acosta and Brian Kim, restricting AP access, which the courts eventually ruled against, recognizing them as viewpoint discrimination.
But the strategy for the second term, starting in 2025, has shifted from rhetoric and access battles to the systematic use of executive and regulatory authority, the actual weaponization of government agencies against media outlets that are perceived as critical.
And this strategy is intellectually anchored by a maximalist view of executive power known as the unitary executive theory.
Right. This theory posits that the president controls all executive power, allowing him to dictate the actions of agencies that Congress intended to be independent.
And the mechanism for implementing this was Executive Order 14244 in February 2025.
EO 14244 sought to bring independent regulatory agencies, specifically including the FCC, under much closer presidential supervision. It mandates that significant regulatory actions must be submitted to the White House's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, and the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, for review before they can be finalized.
And historically, agencies like the FCC were immune from that kind of centralized review.
They were. So this gives the White House the ability to politically screen, pressure, or simply slow down regulatory actions from agencies they might disagree with.
And since this shift, we are seeing immediate, specific regulatory pressures from the FCC under its current leadership that critics view as clearly politically motivated.
Oh, we see several examples. The FCC reopened old complaints against CBS News immediately following a 60 Minutes interview with Cleo Harris, right after President Trump publicly attacked the interview and filed his own lawsuit against CBS. They also reinstated previously dismissed complaints against ABC and NBC stations. This sends a very clear signal. Your past programming is now fair game for political scrutiny.
But maybe the most strategically controversial action is the FCC's investigation into the underwriting compliance and the diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI policies of major media companies like Disney and Comcast.
This is key because it expands the traditional interpretation of the FCC's license mandate. Historically, the FCC looked at employment discrimination, sure, but generally, DEI policies related to programming or broader corporate initiatives were outside the scope of broadcast license compliance.
Right.
By citing these policies as potentially relevant to license qualification, the FCC creates a powerful strategic political pressure tool against media giants over cultural and political issues that extend far beyond technical broadcasting rules. It's a very effective way to put large companies on the defensive.
And it's not just commercial media. Public media has been aggressively targeted as well, leveraging executive power.
Absolutely. Executive Order 14238 in March 2025 aimed to eliminate non-statutory components at the U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM, which oversees entities like Voice of America. This led to the functional shutdown of VOA domestic operations and the termination of employee contracts.
So that move essentially silenced the domestic operations of a U.S. government news organization known for reporting accurate, often unbiased, news abroad, a clear message about which narratives the administration prefers to control.
And this was followed by the administration announcing plans to ask Congress to rescind $1.1 billion in funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which supports NPR and PBS, citing alleged bias and waste. This is an economic attack on institutions perceived as critical, directly following public calls for defunding them.
So when we step back and look at these U.S. actions together, the rhetoric, the regulatory targeting, the attacks on public media, it aligns with a recognizable global pattern used by illiberal leaders to control information. It's the authoritarian playbook.
It mirrors exactly the trends we've seen in countries like Hungary and Turkey when democratic systems begin to erode. The playbook is consistent. First, systematic delegitimization through rhetoric like fake news. Second, regulatory pressure using regulators like the FCC to target critical media outlets. Third, weakening public media, the VOA and CPB actions, parallel state takeovers, or severe funding cuts in other transitioning democracies. And fourth, economic pressure, strategic lawsuits, and encouraging boycotts.
The implication is pretty clear. By placing the U.S. situation within this international trend of democratic erosion, we see that the systematic goal is to undermine accountability and encourage a chilling effect on journalistic independence.
And that is the profound final irony. The Fairness Doctrine was repealed because it supposedly created a chilling effect on covering controversy. Now, executive and regulatory power is being used to create a new, targeted chilling effect designed to suppress critical coverage altogether, achieving the complete opposite of the doctrine's original good faith intent. The repeal of the Fairness Doctrine didn't just create partisan media. It removed the structural defense that required even broadcast monopolies to acknowledge a shared public reality. Now, in the digital age, we face a greater danger. Executive power is aggressively probing the boundaries of constitutional limits to impose control over a media ecosystem that already lacks any cohesive, civic-minded regulatory framework.
So what does this all mean? I mean, the turbulence of the internet age is a historical echo of past information revolutions, from the printing press to television, which always lead to a crisis of authority and a splintering of truth. The key question now is whether American society will adapt, create new checks on power, and rebuild shared trust, or whether we will remain paralyzed by a digital abundance that has paradoxically led to informational scarcity, the scarcity of reliable shared facts.
History assures us that adaptation is possible, but the interim period of change is often painful, marked by conflict and mistrust. We are in the middle of that storm right now, struggling to build institutions and norms that fit the complex, fragmented, and increasingly weaponized information environment that was left behind when that single regulatory paragraph was deleted back in 1987.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. And it makes you wonder if the scarcity that mattered in 1934 was airwaves, and the scarcity that matters now is attention. What will be the scarce resource we're fighting over in another 50 years?